Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the surveyor ship Horizon, staring at the empty communication screen. He had been trying to contact New Haven Colony for the past 2 hours. Nothing. Not even static. Just silence. Lieutenant Amy Brooks turned from her station, her face tight with concern. She had been working the communications array for years and knew every trick to boost a signal. None of them were working now. The colony was simply not responding. Captain Linda Hayes crossed her arms and looked out at the stars ahead. New Haven was supposed to be a routine check-in, nothing more. The colony had been on Theta 7 for 15 years. 12,000 people called it home, farmers mostly and their families, people who wanted a quiet life away from the crowded inner worlds. They grew crops, raised children, and built a peaceful community on a beautiful green planet. Jake felt a cold weight in his stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Linda made her decision quickly. She ordered the Horizon to move at full speed toward Theta 7. The ship lurched forward, its engines pushing hard through space. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Jake could see the worry on their faces. Everyone knew that colonies did not just go silent. 3 hours later, they entered orbit around Theta 7. What they saw made Jake's blood run cold. The orbital stations were gone. Not damaged. Gone. Where there should have been 3 defensive satellites and 2 docking platforms, there was only debris. Twisted metal floated in lazy circles around the planet. Pieces of hull plating drifted past the Horizon's viewports, some still glowing faintly from heat. Amy's hands shook as she scanned the wreckage. She found the identification codes on some of the larger fragments. They matched New Haven's orbital infrastructure. Something had destroyed everything in orbit with overwhelming force. Linda ordered a full sensor sweep of the planet's surface. The results came back within minutes. Jake wished they had not. Every settlement showed heat signatures consistent with plasma bombardment. The main colony center, where most families lived, registered as a scorched crater 300 meters wide. The outlying farms were burned to ash. The spaceport was melted slag. There were no power signatures, no communications, no life signs. Jake volunteered to lead the landing party. Linda agreed without hesitation. She knew he needed to see it with his own eyes, even though part of her wanted to spare him that. The shuttle descended through Theta 7's atmosphere in silence. The planet's sky was still blue. The ocean still sparkled in the sunlight. Nature did not care what had happened to the humans who had tried to make this world their home. They landed on the outskirts of what used to be New Haven's central square. Jake stepped off the shuttle ramp and immediately smelled the acrid stench of burned plastic and metal. The ground beneath his boots was blackened and cracked. Heat still radiated from some surfaces. The buildings were gone. Not collapsed. Simply gone. Vaporized by weapons so hot they left only glass and ash behind. Jake walked through the ruins slowly, his team spreading out around him. They wore full environmental suits not because the air was toxic, but because they might find remains. They did. Jake found the first body near what might have been a school. It was small, a child. The plasma fire had been so intense that little remained, but enough to know. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he moved on. There was work to do. Over the next 4 hours, they mapped the destruction. Every building had been hit. Every vehicle destroyed. The power plant was a crater. The water treatment facility had been systematically demolished. This was not a random attack. This was methodical extermination. Amy, who had come down with the second shuttle, found something in the ruins of the communications center. A backup recorder, shielded in a reinforced bunker that had somehow survived. She brought it to Jake with trembling hands. They played the recording on the shuttle. Jake wished they had not. The voice was calm at first. Mayor Stephen Wright, identifying himself and requesting communication with the approaching fleet. He stated that New Haven was a peaceful agricultural colony with no military installations. He offered to coordinate landing zones for a diplomatic meeting. The calm did not last. The next recordings were frantic. Wright begging the attacking ships to cease fire. Children were dying. People were burning. They surrendered. Please, they surrendered. The attacks continued. The recording ended with screams. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Amy was crying silently. The other team members stood in shocked silence. They found more evidence in the wreckage. Weapon signatures in the melted ground, chemical traces in the atmosphere, fragments of ship hull with distinct markings. Jake's science officer, a quiet man named Paul Chen, analyzed everything carefully. His conclusion was definitive. The Varkoth Dominion had done this. Jake knew about the Varkoth. Everyone in human space did. They were a reptilian species, aggressive and territorial. They controlled a large empire on the galactic frontier. Humanity had encountered them before, mostly in tense border disputes. There had been small skirmishes, harsh words, and threats, but never open war, never anything like this. The Varkoth had always been careful before. They pushed boundaries but pulled back when pushed in return. They were bullies but calculated ones. This attack was different. This was genocide. Jake collected samples of everything. DNA traces for identification, weapon residue, ship fragments, data logs. Every piece of evidence was carefully documented and stored. When the tribunals came, and they would come, humanity would need proof. Before they left, Jake stood in the center of what used to be New Haven's town square. He tried to imagine it as it had been. Children playing, families shopping, people laughing and living their lives. Now there was only ash and silence. He activated his communicator and sent an emergency transmission to Earth. The message was encrypted with the highest priority codes. New Haven colony had been destroyed. 12,000 human beings were dead. This was not a border incident. This was an act of war. The Horizon left Theta-7 carrying the black box data and genetic samples. They would be used to identify the dead, to tell families that their loved ones were gone. Jake looked back at the planet through the viewport as they climbed toward orbit. Theta-7 was still beautiful from space, green and blue and peaceful. The graves of 12,000 people looked like paradise from up here. The message reached Earth 3 days later. It arrived in the middle of the night, Geneva time, but President Marcus Webb was woken immediately. He read the report in his office, alone. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he began making calls. Within hours, the Terran Council was in emergency session. Representatives from every human colony and world gathered in person or by hologram. The chamber was packed. The mood was dark. Marcus stood before them and spoke plainly. New Haven was gone. Every man, woman, and child murdered. The evidence pointed to the Varkoth Dominion. They had attacked without warning, without provocation. They had ignored surrender. They had killed everyone. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted. Some called for immediate military action. Others urged caution. A few, very few, suggested diplomatic solutions. Those voices were drowned out quickly. Marcus let them shout. They needed to. When the chamber finally quieted, he spoke again. His voice was cold and hard. Humanity would not accept this. Humanity would not forgive this. The Varkoth had killed 12,000 innocent people. They would answer for that crime. The vote was overwhelming. The Terran Council authorized the mobilization of military forces. Admiral Claire Bennett, commander of the Terran fleet, was given full authority to prepare for war. The news spread through human space like wildfire. On Earth, on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, on colonies dozens of light years away, humanity heard about New Haven. They saw the images of the ruins. They heard the recordings of Mayor Wright begging for mercy that never came, and they responded. Military recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Retired veterans requested reactivation. Defense contractors accelerated production schedules. Shipyards began working around the clock. The entire human civilization turned its attention toward one goal: justice. Jake Morrison watched the mobilization from the horizon as they made their way back to Earth. He would deliver his evidence in person, testify before the council, and then request assignment to the fleet. He was done surveying. He was done exploring. The Varkoth had started something they did not understand. They had killed 12,000 humans and thought humanity would accept it. They thought humans would file diplomatic protests and move on. They thought wrong. Jake looked at the picture on his desk. His sister had lived on New Haven. She and her husband and their 3 children. They had sent him a message just a week before, talking about the harvest and how the children were doing in school. They were happy there. They loved their life. Now they were ash. Jake did not cry. He was beyond that now. He simply stared at the picture and made a promise. The Varkoth would pay, not just the ones who pulled the triggers and dropped the bombs, all of them. Their military, their government, everyone who had allowed this to happen. Humanity was coming, and when humanity came, the galaxy would learn a lesson it would never forget. You do not murder human children and walk away. Admiral Claire Bennett stood in the command center at Fleet Headquarters on Mars, watching the holographic display show ship movements across human space. Every indicator was green and climbing. The mobilization was proceeding faster than anyone had expected. She had been a naval officer for 30 years. She had fought pirates, negotiated with hostile aliens, and commanded fleets in a dozen minor conflicts. But she had never seen humanity unite like this. Every colony, every world, every station was contributing. Ships that had been in mothballs for decades were being pulled out and refitted. New vessels were being rushed through construction. The yards at Olympus Station alone were producing a cruiser every 3 days. Commander Pete Richards approached with a data pad. He was her chief tactical officer and one of the best strategic minds in the fleet. He looked tired. Everyone did. No one had slept much since New Haven. Pete showed her the latest numbers. 347 warships would be ready within 2 weeks. Another 100 would follow within a month. Support vessels, supply ships, medical frigates, and transport carriers would bring the total force to over 600 vessels. It was the largest military deployment humanity had ever attempted. Claire studied the numbers carefully. It was impressive, but she had to be smart about this. The Varkoth Dominion controlled dozens of star systems. Their military was large and experienced. Humanity had the advantage of righteous anger, but anger alone would not win a war. She called a meeting of all senior commanders. They gathered in the war room, some in person, others by hologram from their ships. Captain Danny Walsh commanded the carrier Valiant. Captain Nicole Grant had the dreadnought Retribution. Captain Henry Cole led the cruiser squadron. Captain Julia Martinez commanded the fast attack group. 24 other captains and admirals filled the room. Claire began without preamble. They were going to strike at the heart of the Varkoth Dominion, not the border outposts where the Varkoth would expect them, not the frontier worlds where humanity would waste time and resources. They would hit military targets deep in Varkoth space, shipyards, supply depots, command centers. They would cripple the Varkoth ability to wage war. Some of the officers objected. It was too aggressive, too dangerous. The supply lines would be stretched. They could be cut off. Claire listened patiently, then dismissed their concerns. The Varkoth had shown humanity what they were capable of. They had murdered 12,000 civilians without mercy. Humanity would show them the consequences. Speed and overwhelming force would be their weapons. The Varkoth would not have time to respond effectively. Pete laid out the operational plan. They called it Operation Righteous Fury. The fleet would jump to the edge of Varkoth space and then advance in 3 battle groups. Danny's carrier group would provide fighter support and strike capability. Nicole's dreadnoughts would handle heavy combat. Henry's cruisers would maintain supply lines and secure conquered positions. Julia's fast attack ships would raid targets of opportunity and keep the Varkoth off balance. The plan was bold. Some said reckless. But Claire saw the fire in the eyes of her officers. They wanted this. They needed this. New Haven demanded justice, and they would deliver it. While the military prepared, Ambassador Kevin Stone faced a different battle on the diplomatic front. He stood before the Galactic Assembly, a massive chamber where representatives from 40 different species gathered to discuss interstellar affairs. It was supposed to be a forum for peace and cooperation. Today it felt like a courtroom. Kevin presented the evidence from New Haven. He showed the images of destruction. He played the recordings of Mayor Wright's pleas for mercy. He displayed the weapon signatures that proved Varkoth involvement beyond any doubt. He spoke clearly and calmly, letting the facts speak for themselves. The response was mixed. Some species expressed sympathy. The Nereids, an aquatic people who valued peace, offered condolences. The Skrell, insectoid beings who had also suffered from Varkoth aggression, nodded their understanding. A few others murmured agreement, but many remained silent. Some species saw humanity as upstarts, newcomers who had expanded too quickly and too aggressively. Others feared the Varkoth and did not want to take sides. A few, Kevin suspected, were simply indifferent. 12,000 dead humans meant nothing to them. The Varkoth representative, a tall reptilian named Scarth, spoke with cold disdain. He claimed that New Haven had violated territorial boundaries. The colony had been built in a disputed zone without proper authorization. The humans had been warned. They had ignored those warnings. The Varkoth Dominion had acted within its rights to protect its borders. It was a lie. Kevin knew it. Everyone in the chamber knew it. The boundaries Scarth referenced had never been formalized. New Haven had been, in unclaimed space, documented and registered with the Assembly itself. But Scarth did not care about truth. He sneered as he spoke, making it clear that the Varkoth considered humanity weak. The deaths at New Haven were not a tragedy. They were a lesson. Humans should stay in their own territory and stop expanding into space the Varkoth desired. Kevin felt rage building inside him, but he kept his face neutral. He thanked the Assembly for their time and requested a formal condemnation of the Varkoth actions. The vote would come later. He already knew how it would go. The Assembly would issue a statement of concern. They would call for restraint on all sides. They would form a committee to investigate. In other words, they would do nothing. Kevin sent his report back to Earth. President Marcus Webb read it and was not surprised. He had never expected help from the Assembly. This was something humanity would handle alone. The Varkoth response came 3 days later. Supreme Commander Krathzor, the military leader of the Varkoth Dominion, issued a statement. It was broadcast across all frequencies, meant to be heard by the entire galaxy. Krathzor was contemptuous. He acknowledged that Varkoth forces had destroyed New Haven. He did not apologize. Instead, he suggested that humanity accept the loss and withdraw to their core worlds. If the humans were wise, they would not test Varkoth's strength further. The Dominion had crushed many species who challenged them. Humanity would be no different. It was a threat wrapped in arrogance. Krathzor clearly believed that humanity would back down when faced with the full might of the Varkoth military. He was about to learn how wrong he was. On Mars, in the massive assembly hall at Olympus Station, Admiral Claire Bennett gathered her fleet commanders for final briefings. The ships were ready, the crews were trained, the supplies were loaded. It was time. Captain Danny Walsh stood beside his fighter wing commanders, reviewing strike patterns. His carrier Valiant would launch the first waves, hitting Varkoth defenses before the main fleet engaged. He had 200 fighters ready to fly, and every pilot was eager for action. Captain Nicole Grant inspected her dreadnought Retribution personally. The ship was a monster, nearly 2 kilometers long, bristling with railguns and missile tubes. Its armor could withstand sustained bombardment. Its weapons could crack a planet. Nicole had named it well. Retribution was coming. Captain Henry Cole coordinated with logistics officers. His cruisers would need to establish supply lines quickly. The fleet would be operating far from human space. They could not afford to run out of ammunition or fuel in enemy territory. Captain Julia Martinez prepared her fast attack squadron. Her ships were smaller and faster, designed for hit-and-run tactics. She would strike at Varkoth convoys and supply lines, creating chaos behind enemy lines. Across the fleet, 50,000 men and women prepared for war. Marines checked their weapons. Engineers tested ship systems. Medical staff stocked their bays with supplies for the wounded that would inevitably come. Chaplains held services for those who wanted them. Jake Morrison had been assigned to the Valiant as a tactical consultant. His knowledge of the New Haven site and Varkoth weapon signatures made him valuable. He stood in the observation deck, watching the fleet assemble in Mars orbit. Hundreds of ships, all gathering for a single purpose. He thought about his sister again, about her children, about the 12,000 people who had died on Theta 7. The fleet could not bring them back. Nothing could, but it could ensure that their deaths meant something. It could show the galaxy that humanity protected its own. On Earth, President Marcus Webb addressed the human species in a live broadcast. His speech was carried on every channel, every frequency, every network across human space. Billions watched. He spoke of New Haven, of the families who had built lives there, of the children who would never grow up, of the peaceful farmers who had harmed no one. He spoke of the Varkoth attack, of the ignored surrenders, of the methodical murder of innocents. Then he spoke of justice. Humanity would not allow this crime to go unpunished. The Terran fleet was mobilizing. It would strike at the Varkoth Dominion with overwhelming force. Not for conquest, not for revenge, for justice, and to ensure that no other human colony would ever suffer New Haven's fate. He finished with a simple statement. Humanity stood together. Every man, every woman, every child across dozens of worlds was united. The Varkoth had tried to teach humanity a lesson in fear. Instead, they had unleashed something far more dangerous. They had awakened Earth's fury. The speech resonated across human civilization. People gathered in. The fleet emerged from slipspace at the edge of Varkoth-controlled territory, in perfect formation. 347 warships materialized in the darkness of space, their running lights creating a constellation of human fury. It was the largest battle fleet in human history, and it had come for blood. Admiral Claire Bennett stood on the bridge of her flagship, the battleship Endeavour, and watched the tactical displays light up with data. The Varkoth border stations had detected them immediately. Good. She wanted them to know humanity was coming. Commander Pete Richards stood beside her, coordinating fleet movements with practiced efficiency. The three battle groups separated smoothly, each moving toward their assigned targets. This was the moment they had trained for, planned for, lived for since New Haven fell silent. Their first target was Kraltos Prime, a fortress world deep in Varkoth territory. It was a major military installation, home to shipyards, barracks, and the regional fleet command. Intelligence suggested 20 Varkoth warships defended the system, along with orbital fortresses and planetary defense batteries. The Varkoth fleet moved to intercept, confident in their numbers and firepower. They had fought dozens of wars and crushed every opponent. They expected the humans to be no different. They were wrong. Captain Danny Walsh stood in the Combat Information Center of the carrier Valiant, watching his fighter squadrons launch. 200 strike craft poured from the carrier's bays, forming into attack wings with practiced precision. Danny's wing commanders knew their jobs. They would hit the Varkoth command ships first, targeting communications and sensor arrays. The fighters screamed toward the Varkoth fleet at full acceleration. Point defense batteries opened fire, filling space with plasma bursts and energy beams. 3 fighters died in the first seconds, then 2 more. But the rest broke through, missiles streaking toward their targets. The lead Varkoth battleship, a massive vessel bristling with weapons, took 6 missiles to its command tower. The structure exploded in a ball of fire, debris spinning into space. 2 more Varkoth ships suffered similar hits, their bridges torn open, their commanders dead or dying. While the fighters created chaos, Captain Nicole Grant brought the retribution into range. The Dreadnought's main railguns were monstrous weapons, accelerating solid slugs to a fraction of light speed using electromagnetic rails. When those slugs hit, they hit with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. Nicole gave the order to fire. The retribution shuddered as its railguns discharged. 6 slugs crossed the distance to the Varkoth fleet in less than 3 seconds. They punched through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons but were useless against kinetic projectiles moving at such velocity. A Varkoth cruiser broke in half, its reactor exploding seconds later. A destroyer simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the impact. A battleship took a hit near its engines and began spinning out of control, secondary explosions tearing through its hull. The Varkoth fought back desperately. Their plasma cannons were powerful, capable of melting through armor in seconds. The destroyer Phoenix took a direct hit to its midsection and broke apart. Its crew lost. The frigate Liberty had its engines blown off and went dark, drifting helplessly. But humanity's coordination and technology were overwhelming. While the big ships traded fire, thousands of automated combat drones swarmed the Varkoth vessels. The drones were small, fast, and expendable. They attacked point defense systems, communication arrays, sensor clusters. The Varkoth defenses were designed for ship-to-ship combat, not swarms of tiny attackers. Colonel Greg Turner led the marine assault on Kraltos Prime's orbital stations. His drop pods launched from the assault carrier Defiant, crossing the space between ships in minutes. Varkoth fighters tried to intercept but were cut down by Valiant's combat air patrol. The pod slammed into the station's hull, cutting through armor with shaped charges. Greg and his Marines poured into the corridors, their powered armor making them nearly invincible against Varkoth's small arms. They moved through the station methodically, securing key areas and destroying defense systems. A Varkoth warrior, massive and reptilian, charged Greg with a plasma blade. Greg shot him twice in the chest with his rifle, the rounds punching through scales and bone. More Varkoth defenders appeared, but they were outmatched. Human weapons, human armor, and human training were superior. Within 2 hours, the orbital defenses were silent. The Varkoth fleet was destroyed or fleeing. Kralthos Prime's shipyards burned. Admiral Bennett ordered the fleet to move on to the next target. There were dozens more. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light travel. Species that had dismissed humanity as weak watched in shock as the Terran fleet carved through Varkoth space. The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session, but it was meaningless. Humanity was not asking for permission or approval. They were delivering justice. The fleet struck at Varkoth supply depots next. Captain Julia Martinez led her fast attack squadron in devastating raids. Her ships would jump in, destroy everything valuable, and jump out before reinforcements could arrive. Fuel storage facilities, ammunition dumps, food distribution centers, all reduced to debris. The Varkoth military scrambled to respond. Supreme Commander Krathzor recalled fleets from across the Empire, pulling forces from border regions and patrol zones. He was furious that the primitive humans had dared to attack his territory. He would crush them personally. Krathzor assembled a massive counterfleet, nearly 200 ships. It was the largest force the Varkoth had gathered in decades. He moved to intercept the human fleet at a strategic choke point in the Veil Nebula, a region of space filled with electromagnetic storms and sensor interference. Admiral Bennett received intelligence about the Varkoth fleet movement. Pete analyzed the data and confirmed it was Krathzor himself commanding. This was exactly what they wanted. Killing the Supreme Commander would decapitate Varkoth military leadership. Claire ordered the fleet to the Veil Nebula. If Krathzor wanted a battle, he would get one. The two fleets met in the swirling chaos of the nebula. The electromagnetic storms made long-range sensors useless. Visual identification was limited. Combat became brutally close range, ships firing at targets only kilometers away. The battle lasted 3 days. It was savage, confused, desperate fighting. Captain Danny Walsh's fighters launched strike after strike, navigating through the storms by instinct and skill. They targeted Varkoth supply ships and troop carriers, cutting off reinforcements to the front line. Captain Nicole Grant's Retribution anchored the center of the human line, its massive guns firing continuously. The dreadnought took dozens of hits, its armor scarred and melted, but it held position. Nicole refused to retreat, knowing that if the center broke, the entire fleet would be vulnerable. Captain Henry Cole's cruisers fought off Varkoth flanking attacks. His ships were outnumbered but better coordinated. They used the nebula's storms as cover, appearing suddenly to unleash devastating broadsides before disappearing again. Colonel Greg Turner's Marines boarded a Varkoth battleship that had been disabled by railgun fire. They fought through its corridors room by room, facing fanatical resistance. The Varkoth warriors were larger and stronger than humans, but human weapons and tactics prevailed. When they reached the ship's reactor, they set demolition charges and evacuated. The explosion lit up the nebula for hundreds of kilometers. Commander Pete Richards coordinated a desperate maneuver on the second day. He noticed that a significant portion of the Varkoth fleet was pursuing damaged human ships into a gravity well created by a collapsed star. Pete ordered massed railgun fire into that region at a precise moment. The kinetic slugs, combined with the intense gravity, created a cascade effect. Varkoth ships were pulled together, colliding and exploding. Nearly 30 vessels were destroyed in minutes. It was brilliant tactical thinking born from desperation. The carrier Defiant took critical damage on the third day. Its flight deck was torn open, its engines failing. Captain Walsh ordered the Valiant to cover its withdrawal, putting his own ship at risk. The Terran cruiser Normandy saw what was happening and charged directly at a Varkoth battleship that was targeting the Defiant. The Normandy's captain, a woman named Ruth Palmer, ordered ramming speed. Her ship accelerated directly into the Varkoth vessel, slamming into its side at tremendous velocity. Both ships exploded in a fireball that consumed hundreds of lives, but the Defiant escaped. When the storms finally cleared on the fourth day, the battlefield was revealed in all its horror. Hundreds of ships destroyed, debris fields stretching for thousands of kilometers, bodies floating in the void. The human fleet had lost 63 vessels, thousands of lives, but the Varkoth fleet was annihilated, 178 ships destroyed, the rest scattered and fleeing. And among the wreckage, search teams found Krath-Zor's flagship, the Dominion's Fang. It was a gutted hulk. Its hull breached in a dozen places. They found Krath-Zor's body in the command center, crushed by falling debris when a railgun slug had punched through the ship's armor. The supreme commander of the Varkoth Dominion was dead. Admiral Claire Bennett stood in the Endeavor's bridge looking at the casualty reports. So many dead, so many ships lost. The price of justice. The news of the Veil Nebula battle reached Earth 3 days after the fighting ended. President Marcus Webb stood in his office reading the casualty lists. 63 ships lost, nearly 8,000 service members dead, thousands more wounded. The numbers were staggering, and the war was not over yet. But the reports also confirmed that Supreme Commander Krath-Zor was dead, and the Varkoth military was in disarray. The path to their homeworld was open. Marcus authorized Admiral Bennett to continue operations. New Haven demanded justice, and humanity would see it through to the end. Across human space, the public reaction was complex. Pride mixed with grief. Victory tempered by loss. Memorial services were held on every world. Families mourned their dead. But no one called for the war to end. Not yet. Not until the Varkoth truly understood what they had done. The Galactic Assembly convened again, this time in emergency session. The chamber was packed with representatives from dozens of species. The atmosphere was tense. Humanity's military campaign had shocked the galaxy. Species that had dismissed humans as newcomers now watched with fearful respect. Some delegates called for intervention. The Terrellian Collective, a group of peaceful trading worlds, demanded that both sides cease hostilities immediately. They argued that the destruction was getting out of control, that innocent lives were at risk throughout the region. Others remained silent. The Skrell representatives watched quietly, their insectoid faces unreadable. They had suffered Varkoth raids for decades. They had no love for the Reptilian Empire. Humanity's vengeance served their interests perfectly. The Draxian hegemony's ambassador, a calculating strategist named Krell, proposed a coalition force to restore order. He suggested that multiple species should work together to force both humans and Varkoth to negotiate. His words sounded reasonable, diplomatic, measured. Ambassador Kevin Stone saw through the facade immediately. The Draxians were not interested in peace. They were interested in opportunity. While humanity and the Varkoth destroyed each other, the Draxians could expand their influence. They could present themselves as peacekeepers while actually strengthening their own position. Kevin stood before the assembly and spoke clearly. Humanity appreciated the concern of the galactic community, but humanity would finish what the Varkoth had started. The destruction of New Haven was not a border dispute. It was genocide. 12,000 innocent people had been murdered while trying to surrender. Any species that stood with the Varkoth stood with genocidal murderers. The chamber erupted in argument. Some species protested Kevin's harsh words. Others nodded agreement. The assembly dissolved into chaos. Kevin left the chamber knowing that no help would come from that quarter. Humanity stood alone, but humanity had always stood alone in this fight. Behind closed doors, however, some species reached out privately. A Nereid diplomat named Asara approached Kevin's aide, Lieutenant Lisa Morgan, in a quiet corridor. The Nereids were aquatic beings, peaceful by nature but possessing extensive intelligence networks. Asara offered information. The Nereids had been monitoring Varkoth communications. They had detailed maps of military installations throughout Varkoth space. They had intelligence on fleet movements, supply routes, and command structures. All of this information could be humanity's, if humans promised to remember who their friends were when the war ended. Lisa brought the offer to Kevin, who accepted immediately. The intelligence was invaluable. He sent it to Admiral Bennett with encryption so heavy that even the Assembly's monitoring systems could not crack it. A few hours later, a small delegation of Skrell arrived at Kevin's diplomatic vessel. They brought encrypted data chips containing information on Varkoth command protocols and weakness in their defensive systems. The Skrell said nothing about why they were helping. They did not need to. Their people had suffered at Varkoth hands for generations. Humanity's war was their revenge, too. While diplomacy unfolded, the Terran fleet continued its campaign. Admiral Claire Bennett used the new intelligence to select her next targets carefully. She ordered strikes against Varkoth shipyards, cutting off their ability to replace losses. She targeted fuel refineries, strangling their fleet's mobility. She hit command centers, creating chaos in their chain of command. But she also made a controversial decision. Intelligence suggested that the Varkoth Military Academy on the planet Scaran was training a new generation of officers. These officers would become the commanders who led future Varkoth aggression. Bennett wanted to strike the academy. Commander Pete Richards objected. Attacking an academy felt wrong, too much like targeting civilians. The facility was on a populated planet. There would be collateral damage no matter how precise the strike. Bennett understood his concerns. She held a conference with her senior officers. Captain Danny Walsh argued that the academy had produced the officers who ordered New Haven's destruction. They were legitimate military targets. Captain Nicole Grant agreed but insisted that they minimize civilian casualties. Captain Henry Cole suggested giving civilians time to evacuate the area before the strike. Bennett made her decision. They would strike the academy, but they would do it precisely. Fighter strikes on the military complex only. No orbital bombardment of population centers. They would give the Varkoth civilians a warning to evacuate the area around the academy. It was more mercy than the Varkoth had shown New Haven. The strike on Scaran was launched 3 days later. Captain Danny Walsh personally led the fighter wings. They dropped from orbit in tight formation, their targeting systems locked on the academy's barracks, training facilities, and command structures. Varkoth planetary defenses opened fire. Energy beams and missiles filled the air. 2 fighters were destroyed in the first pass. 3 more went down on the second run. But the strikes were accurate. The Academy's main buildings collapsed under precision munitions. Training grounds were cratered. Weapons depots exploded in massive fireballs. Colonel Greg Turner's Marines landed to secure ground-based shield generators that were protecting the Academy. They fought through Varkoth defenders with grim efficiency. The battle was fierce, but human training and equipment won out. Turner's team destroyed the shield generators, allowing the fighters to complete their mission. As Turner's unit evacuated, they encountered Varkoth civilians fleeing the combat zone. Families, children, elderly Varkoth stumbling through smoke and debris. Turner's Marines could have ignored them, or even fired on them as enemy nationals. But Turner remembered New Haven. He remembered that humans were supposed to be better than the Varkoth. He ordered his Marines to provide safe passage for the civilians. His team escorted Varkoth families away from the fighting, protecting them from crossfire and collapsing buildings. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. The footage was captured by Marine helmet cameras. It spread across galactic networks within hours. People across the galaxy watched human soldiers protecting enemy civilians. It was not what they expected from a species waging total war. It complicated the narrative that humanity was seeking revenge without mercy. Some species began to reconsider their positions. Perhaps humanity was not the aggressor here. Perhaps they were simply defending their own in the only way the Varkoth understood. Perhaps the real monsters in this conflict were the ones who had started it. But not everyone was impressed. The Draxian hegemony saw humanity's mercy as weakness. Krell reported to his superiors that the humans were hesitant, conflicted. They could be pressured. The hegemony began moving military assets toward key strategic positions. Admiral Claire Bennett received intelligence about Draxian fleet movements. Her analyst believed the Draxians were positioning to block humanity's advance on Vark-Thraxus. They intended to force a negotiated settlement, one that would benefit Draxian interests. Bennett called another conference with her officers. The situation was becoming complicated. Fighting the Varkoth was one thing. A potential conflict with the Draxians was something else entirely. The Draxian military was massive and well-equipped. A 2-front war could destroy the Terran fleet. Captain Nicole Grant argued for pressing forward regardless. They had come too far to stop now. Captain Danny Walsh agreed. They could not let the Draxians intimidate them into backing down. Captain Henry Cole urged caution. Engaging the Draxians would turn this into a wider galactic conflict. Bennett listened to all perspectives. Then she made a decision that would define the rest of the war. They would continue to Vark Thraxus. If the Draxians tried to stop them, humanity would deal with that when it happened. But they would not be turned aside. New Haven deserved justice, and justice demanded that humanity finish what they started. The fleet began its final approach to the Varkoth homeworld. Ships were repaired as much as possible. Supplies were rationed. Ammunition was counted. Every captain knew they were about to face the most dangerous phase of the war. Jake Morrison stood in the Valiant's briefing room, watching strategic displays. Vark Thraxus was heavily defended. Orbital fortresses, planetary shields, and whatever remained of the Varkoth fleet. Taking the planet would cost lives. Possibly a lot of lives. He thought about whether it was worth it. 12,000 people were already dead. Thousands more had died in the fighting since. How many? The Terran fleet emerged from slipspace at the edge of the Vark Thraxus system. Weapons hot and ready for battle. Admiral Claire Bennett expected to see Varkoth defenses arrayed against them. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. The Draxian fleet was already there, over 200 warships positioned between humanity and the Varkoth homeworld. They were in a defensive formation, clearly ready to block any advance. The Draxians had beaten them to the system. Commander Pete Richards analyzed the tactical situation quickly. The Draxian fleet was massive and well-positioned. Fighting through them would cost hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Even if humanity won, they would be too weakened to take Vark Thraxus afterward. Captain Danny Walsh stood on the Valiant's bridge, watching the Draxian vessels on his displays. His pilots were ready to launch, but he knew what a battle here would mean. Total devastation for both sides, and the Varkoth would escape justice. Captain Nicole Grant gripped the arms of her command chair on the Retribution. The Dreadnought's guns were charged and ready. She had come too far to back down now, but she also understood the stakes. Fighting the Draxians would turn this into a galactic war. Admiral Bennett made her decision. She opened a broadcast on all frequencies, directed not just at the Draxian fleet but at the entire galaxy. She wanted everyone to hear this. She began by showing the evidence from New Haven one more time. The images of destruction, the recordings of people begging for mercy, the proof that the Varkoth had committed genocide against unarmed civilians. She let the evidence speak for itself, stark and undeniable. Then she addressed the Draxians directly. Humanity had come for justice. They would have it. Any species that chose to stand with genocidal murderers would be treated as accomplices to that genocide. The Draxian fleet could withdraw to a neutral position, or they could commit their forces to defending the indefensible. She finished with a simple declaration. Humanity would not be stopped. Not by threats, not by superior numbers, not by political calculations. The Varkoth would answer for their crimes, and anyone who stood in humanity's way would be moved aside. Choose wisely. The transmission ended. Silence filled the space between the two fleets. Millions watched across the galaxy, waiting to see what would happen next. On the Draxian flagship, Admiral Vexcor listened to Bennett's words with growing unease. His orders had been clear. Position the fleet to force negotiations. Show humanity that they could not act unilaterally without consequences. Pressure them into accepting a diplomatic solution. But those orders had been written before the full evidence of New Haven was broadcast to the galaxy. Before the images of murdered children and ignored surrenders were seen by billions of beings across dozens of worlds. The political situation had changed. Vexcor opened a private channel to his senior commanders. The discussion was heated. Some argued for maintaining their position. Draxian honor demanded they not back down. Others pointed out that defending the Varkoth now would make the hegemony complicit in genocide. That was not a position any of them wanted. Meanwhile, Ambassador Kevin Stone and his aide Lisa Morgan worked frantically through diplomatic channels. They contacted Draxian political leadership directly, bypassing the military chain of command. Kevin's message was blunt. The Varkoth had committed an atrocity. Humanity would not stop until justice was served. The Draxians could either step aside and maintain neutrality, or they could commit to a war that would accomplish nothing except mutual destruction. He reminded them of Varkoth raids on Draxian border worlds, of Draxian citizens killed by Varkoth aggression over the years. Why would the hegemony defend such an empire? What strategic benefit was worth being branded as defenders of genocide? The arguments resonated. Draxian political leadership had no love for the Varkoth. They had positioned their fleet purely for strategic advantage, to demonstrate power and extract concessions. But the moral weight of New Haven changed everything. Being seen as protectors of child killers was not worth any strategic gain. New orders were transmitted to Admiral Vexcor. The Draxian fleet was to withdraw to a neutral position. They would not interfere with humanity's operation against Vark Thraxus. The hegemony would maintain strict neutrality in the conflict between humanity and the Varkoth. Vexcor read the orders and felt relief despite the blow to his pride. He had been prepared to follow his original orders even if it meant war. But he had not wanted to die defending the Varkoth. No one in his fleet had. The Draxian vessels powered down their weapons and adjusted their positions. They moved away from the direct path to Vark Thraxus, taking up stations that made their neutrality clear. The blockade was lifted. Admiral Bennett watched the Draxian withdrawal and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The gamble had worked. Humanity had called the Draxian bluff and won. Now nothing stood between the fleet and the Varkoth homeworld. She gave the order to advance. The Terran fleet moved forward in battle formation, approaching Vark Thraxus with weapons ready. The planet appeared on their displays, a large world with green continents and blue oceans. It looked peaceful from orbit. Beautiful, even. The Varkoth defenses activated. Orbital fortresses opened fire. The remnants of their fleet, perhaps 40 ships, moved to intercept. Planetary shields flickered on, covering major population centers. Captain Danny Walsh launched his fighters immediately. They swept toward the Varkoth positions in coordinated waves. The battle was fierce but brief. The Varkoth had lost too many ships, too many commanders. Their defenses were uncoordinated and desperate. Captain Nicole Grant's Retribution led the heavy warships into combat. The Dreadnought's railguns spoke with thunderous authority, destroying orbital fortresses with precision fire. Other human ships added their weapons to the barrage. Within hours, Vark Thraxus's orbital defenses were shattered, but Admiral Bennett did not order a planetary bombardment. She did not unleash the fleet's weapons on the cities below. Instead, she opened a communication channel to the Varkoth government and broadcast her message to the entire planet. She told them that humanity had proven its ability to destroy their military. Their fleets were gone. Their defenses were broken. Now they had a choice: surrender those responsible for New Haven's destruction, agree to reparations and permanent disarmament, submit to galactic oversight to ensure this never happened again, or watch their world burn the way New Haven had burned. The choice was theirs. In the government complex on Vark Thraxus, Varkoth leaders argued frantically. Some wanted to fight to the last. Others recognized that continued resistance would only result in their extinction. The humans had shown they were willing to destroy entire fleets to achieve their goals. There was no reason to think they would hesitate to bombard the planet. After hours of debate, the Varkoth government capitulated. They agreed to humanity's terms. The officers who had planned and executed the New Haven massacre would be handed over. Reparations would be paid. The Varkoth military would be reduced to a defensive force only, subject to regular inspections. It was total surrender. Colonel Greg Turner led the Marine detachment that took custody of the Varkoth war criminals. There were 17 of them. The officers who had ordered the attack commanded the ships and refused the surrender attempts. They were transferred to human custody without resistance. Greg looked at them as they were loaded onto transport shuttles. These beings had ordered the deaths of 12,000 humans, men, women, and children murdered without mercy. He felt no satisfaction in their capture, only a deep weariness. The war was over, but the cost had been enormous. The Terran fleet remained in orbit for 3 weeks while the surrender terms were implemented. Varkoth military vessels were decommissioned. Weapons were cataloged and placed under seal. Reparation payments were arranged. Galactic observers arrived to monitor compliance. Ambassador Kevin Stone addressed the Galactic Assembly one final time. He presented the peace terms and the evidence that justice had been served. The Assembly voted to formally condemn the Varkoth actions at New Haven and recognize humanity's response as justified self-defense under galactic law. It was a significant moment. Humanity had not just won a military victory. They had established themselves as a major power with the will and capability to defend their interests. Other species would think twice before threatening human colonies now, but the cost was staggering. The Terran fleet had lost over 100 ships. Nearly 15,000 service members were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Entire families had lost loved ones. And New Haven was still gone, still silent, still a mass grave under alien stars. President Marcus Webb addressed humanity from Earth one final time. He spoke at the dedication of the New Haven Memorial, a massive structure of black stone inscribed with 12,000 names. The memorial was built on Theta 7 itself, maintained by a permanent Terran garrison. Marcus spoke of the price of security, of the necessity of strength in a dangerous galaxy, of the value of every human life and humanity's commitment to protecting its own. The Varkuth had learned that human lives were not cheap. Human colonies could not be attacked without consequences. The galaxy had learned that lesson, too. The war criminals were tried before an international tribunal. The proceedings were broadcast across human space and beyond. Evidence,